Anyway, my latest update was, I think, on Sunday sometime.
We'll be okay. So today's broadcast, once again, is sponsored by Shmuel Lerner family to be a Refuah Shlema for Akiva Balter, Yehoshua Nosson Akiva ben Tzipora Rochel. So I want to go back a little bit because I actually didn't explain the Gemara properly. Now, we said that the 2 days that you have to have an isolation period preceding them is Yom Kippur and preparing of the Parah Adumah. The Gemara says, how do we know Yom Kippur? It's because we know by the Yom HaShmini, by the Shiva Shemei HaMaluim, for 7 days before the Yom HaShmini, the Kohanim had to isolate. And in the Pasuk that discusses that they have to isolate, the Torah says the following: "This kasher asa b'yom hazeh," like was done on that day on the Yom HaShmini, meaning there was a isolation period of 8 days. Tziva Hashem lasois l'chaper aleichem. So too Hashem commanded to do this elsewhere. So lasois, the Gemara determined, was referring to the Parah Adumah. L'chaper aleichem was referring to a day of Kapara. The Gemara was probing which day of Kapara it is. How do you know that it's Yom Kippur? So the Gemara,
I never understand why we think it has to apply elsewhere other than the Maluim.
Because the pasuk seems to indicate it. The pasuk says, "Kasher asa b'yom hazeh," just like was done on that day. Tziva Hashem lasos l'chaper aleichem. Hashem commanded to do that. So the question is, what is Hashem commanding them to do? In addition to what was done on that day, Kasher asa b'yom hazeh, Tziva Hashem lasos l'chaper aleichem. Hashem commanded to do again. So the question is, this pasuk is a little strange because it seems to be saying that the same procedure, same process that they used by the Malum, use it in some other places without being crystal clear as to where those places are. So the Gemara says one must be referring to the Lasos, and Lasos is referring to Parah Adumah, and L'chaper Aleichem is referring to Yom Kippur. So it's a drasha.
Okay, yeah, okay. I just never read that pasuk in that way. That way, okay.
And the project shot of the pasuk is that you did what I commanded you to do.
Right.
That's probably the pasuk reading of it, but it is a little unusual the way it's written, and that's why the Gemara wants to darshan it. So
this is just as an added, complication. The Gemara says that the mitzvah of Parah Adumah was given on the first day of Nisan, which is the Maluim, right? The same day as the Maluim, the mitzvahs of Parah Adumah was given.
So that makes it even better.
Yeah, it does actually. Hayom Hazeh may be referring to that.
Very interesting. Very nice. Very nice. So the Gemara referring to Yom Kippur suggests, good morning, Eddie.
In other words, the Parshas Chukas was given along with 7 other mitzvahs was given
on the first day of the Mishkan.
First day of Nisan.
Wow.
But okay, then we got to figure out how you get Yom Kippur from that the drasha that you have.
Right, and that's what the Gemara is struggling with now.
Yeah. So
it says L'chaper. So I'm on base, about just a little bit less than halfway down. I'm going back a little bit. Yafinon L'chaper, L'chaper, the pasuk L'chaper says Elu Masa Yom Kippur. So the Gemara asks, the only time there's a kapara is Yom Kippurim. Maybe it's any time a korban chatas is brought. So the Gemara said, if it's any time a korban chatas is brought, how is any kohen going to know that he has to? If the kohen comes today and he sees that he's supposed to bring someone's personal korban chatas, how is he going to know 7 days earlier that he was supposed to isolate? So the Gemara says, what's the problem? Let him isolate in advance regardless. In other words, before any kohanim come to do avodah, part of the preparation process should be that they should isolate, so that this way they're ready to handle any korban that's brought to them to process. So the Gemara said, the reason why we want to stick to Yom Kippur is because we want to stick to a day that has a set day. Yom Kippur, every day, every year, the same day, it's a set day on schedule, is when this happens. Yom HaShmini was also a very set day. It was a very on schedule day. So therefore, we don't want to learn to any carbon that's brought any time that it should have that isolation period. So then the Gemara asked, well, if that's the case, what about Yom Tov? And this is where I went a little bit wrong yesterday. So the Ema Regalim, maybe it's referring to the Yom Tovim. They were carbonas of Chatos, Musafim that were brought on the Yom Tovim. So the Gemara says, we can't suggest that it should be all Yom Tovim, they should be this Prisha, because Don and Dover Shanoi Pamachas Peshana, Midover Hanoi Pamachas Peshana. If we're going to look for a day that requires Prisha, it's going to be a day that only occurs once a year, similar to the Yom HaShmini that only occurred once. Lafuki Regalim. So the Gemara then asks, and this is where I went wrong, maybe it's one Yom Tov, one of the Yom Tovim. And if you're going to ask me which one it should be, I would suggest it would either be Chag HaMatzos, because Chag HaMatzos has something special about it. It's always the first Yom Tov referred to when the Torah talks about Yom Tovim. The order is always B'Chag HaMatzos, B'Chag HaShavuos, or B'Chag HaSukkos. Or maybe it should be Chag HaSukkos, Hoil U'Meruba Mitzvosei. Because Sukkot has many mitzvahs. There's Sukkah, there's Lulav, there's Arava, there's Shamayim. So Gemara, it has now a kasha. Why don't we pick one of the two Yom Tovim? Each one has something special about it that would be a reason why it should be given the extra status of the 7 days of isolation. Aladonin Prishas Shiva Liyemechad, Prishas Shiva Liyemechad. We're looking for a day where you could be purish 7 days before it, and the whole Yom Tov is only one day. The Eindon in Prisha Shiva l'Shiva, Prisha Shiva l'Yemechad. By the Yom HaShmini, there was only one day that we were preparing for, and it required 7 days of isolation before it. The Yom Tovim are all 7 days, so therefore, it's not so parallel to the source case, to the case of the Yom HaShmini, and that's why it's better to learn Yom Kippur out of Yom HaShmini, because it's also isolating 7 days for an event that's only 1 day. In fact, more about Shmini, maybe Shmini Atzeres is the Yom Tov that we should make Prisha for, because then it is parallel. The Prisha Shivali and Mechatu, it's also a 1 day Yom Tov. So tomorrow, Donin Dover Shein Kedusha Lefanov, Mi Dover Shein Kedusha Lefanov. The 7 days of isolation preceding the Yom HaShmini was regular days of Chol. So therefore, we want to pick a Yom Tov whose days preceding it will also be the regular days of Chol. So Yom Kippur has the 7 days of the Aseret Shemei Tshuva, regular weekdays. Vein Donin Dover Sheish Kedusha Lefanov, Mi Dover Shein Kedusha Lefanov. Shmini Atzeres, there's 7 days of Yom Tov that precede Shmini Atzeres. It's not as parallel to the case of Yom HaShmini. Correct, Gemara, you're right, it's not parallel, but it's even more of a reason why it should require the preparation of the 7 days of isolation. Something, a Yom Tov that has no Kedusha before it needs Prisha, such as the Yom HaShmini. So Dover Sheish Kedusha Lefanov, Shmini Atzeres, which has 7 days of Kedusha that lead up to it, like Kol Shekein, surely it should be a candidate to require the isolation of a week before. Amar B'Shai Loi Hazeksiv, we learned earlier in the pasuk, it said Hazeh. Hazeh means it should be a day that's exactly like the Yom HaShmini, Hazeh. And that's why we're going to learn to Yom Kippur, because Yom Kippur is the day that's most similar to the Yom HaShmini. It itself is Kodesh, and the week before is Chol, and therefore that week before we'll learn from Yom HaShmini, the Kohen has to isolate. Rav Ashi has another reason to say why Shmini Atzeres shouldn't be that day that requires the 7 days of isolation prior. Because Mi'ika Midi, the Ikarega Loi Boy Prisha, you ever find something where the main Yom Tov itself doesn't need Prisha? The Yom Tov of Sukkot does not need Prisha. But Tafel today, the Yom HaShmini, which is just sort of an added on Yom Tov to Sukkot, that would need Prisha? That's not logical to suggest. Zok to Gemara, Bafilu L'man Omar, Shmini Regel B'fnei Atzmai. If you want to say that Shmini isn't just an add-on to Sukkot, it's a completely independently standing Yom Tov. So don't even focus on the fact that there's something before it. That's coincidental. So the Afilu Madamar, Shmini Regel B'fnei Atzmai, even if you want to claim that the Shmini Atzeres is its own Yom Tov, Hanamili, it only has a status of its own Yom Tov for 6 items. Pizar, Kishav. And what these 6 items are is not 100% clear. There's a little bit of a shaila in Rashi and Tosfos. So Rashi says, Pei stands for pious, which means that during the 7 days of Sukkot, there was no raffles as to who should do what avodah. It seems like there was so much to do that everybody had a rotation, and Rashi even tells us that people would have even 2 or 3 times up to bat because of the abundance of avodas. But on the Yom HaShmini, they had to make a special goyrel to know which coin should be granted which avodah. So that's what the pay stands for. Zayin is man. We know that on Shechiyanu, on Shmini Atzeres, we make a Shechiyanu. Going into the 2nd days of Pesach, we don't make a Shechiyanu, but we do make a Shechiyanu going into Shmini Atzeres. Reish stands for Regel B'fnei Atzmai. It's called Shmini Atzeres. We don't call it Sukkos, we call it Shmini Atzeres. Kuf stands for Karban Atzmai, because the Karbanis of Sukkos is there was a whole lot of animals, and I think every day they brought one more. The Karban of Shmini Atzeres is a completely different Karban. It doesn't have any connection to the sequence of Karbanos that are brought on Sukkot. And Shin is Shir La'atzmai, which is very interesting. Rashi says that you don't say the same type of shear that you said the rest of the day of Sukkot. The rest of the day of Sukkot, the Levium said a shear that had to do with Me'en Gezel, Matnas Anim. Those were on Sukkot. And the Chalamoid, it was a series of shears that are represented by these letters, Hevav Mem Behech Yud. But Shmini Atzeres, it's a completely independent shira. And Rashi says, it's not clear to us what was the shir that the Levim said on Shmini Atzeres. But if we peek down the Tosfos says, Yesh Sha'olu. I remember there were those who said that it was La Matzeach ala Shminis, is what we say in the Beis HaKnesses, the Shema Gam HaLevim, maybe it was this kapitel Tilim of La Matzeach ala Shminis that was the shira for Shmini Atzeres. Now, Tosfos,
Yosy, every regal had its own shira, like besides the
yes. So Levim had a special kapitel that they said for that Yom Tov. So Tosfos also offers up some other things as well. Oh, I didn't get to the base yet. The base is on Shmini Atzeres, they would make a special bracha for the Melech. They would actually say a special bracha, and Rashi brings down, like it says in the Sefer Sukkah, Al Shem B'Yom HaShmini Sholach Hasam V'Yivarchu Hamelech. It says in Malachim, on the 8th day Hashem sent the king sent the people home, and they benched the king. So there was a minute to bench the king on Yom Tov.
The Medina, a bracha for the Medina.
Bracha b'avur Shalom HaMedina. Yeah, maybe that's where it comes from. He brings down from the Tam brings down other differences, such as you make a special bracha b'fnei atzmai brachas hamazon in tefillah, or regel b'fnei atzmai. Tosha brings down could refer to lina. The halacha was whenever you came to the Beis Hamikdash for Yom Tov, you weren't able to leave once a Yom Tov. You had to stay overnight. So if it was if it's a Yom Tov b'fnei atzmai, then you have to stay on Chalamoid. If you came, you wouldn't have to stay overnight. But if you came on Shmini Atzeres, you'd have to stay overnight, which is also a symbol or a litmus test to say that it's a regel b'fnei atzmai. However, even though Shmini Atzeres have so many details that give it its own status as an independent Yom Tov, but the most important thing, avala'in tashlumin derishon. We know you mechuyev to bring a carbon chagiga on Yom Tov. If you didn't bring your carbon chagiga on the first day of Yom Tov, you could bring it the second day, third day, fourth day, and you can even bring it on Shmini Atzeres. So the fact that on Shmini Atzeres you could still bring a carbon that's at the shlumin for the mitzvah of bringing the carbon on Sukkos, that clearly shows al matafel dedehu. That's a clear indication that Shmini Atzeres is an add-on to the Yom Tov of Sukkos, and therefore we can argue that if the Yom Tov of Sukkos itself does not require a period of isolation before Shemini Atzeres shouldn't either. That now we learned. Mishaloi Chag b'yoyim tov harishon shel Chag. If someone didn't bring the chagiga on the first day, chagiga v'hoylech kol haregel kuloi the yom tov ha'achron shel Chag. So now the Gemara says we can find another yom tov that's only one day that would fit the bill perfectly. The Emat Seres. Maybe it's Shavuos. The Prishas Shiva Liyom Echadu. Once again, it would be a separation and isolation of 7 days in preparation of one day. Maybe that is the day. Maybe it's the Yom of Shavuos that requires isolation, not Yom Kippur. On that, the Gemara, Amar of Abba, done in Par Echad, the Ayal Echad, mi Par Echad, the Ayal Echad. We compare a day that you bring one par and one aisle, which was, as Rashi says, the avoidus musaf of Yom Kippur was par echad and aisle echad, from the Yom HaShmini, which also they did the same thing. Avoidus Shmini lemaluyim, there was also a par echad and an aisle echad. So therefore, since the karbonis of Yom Kippur are most similar to the karbonis of the Yom HaShmini, we'd rather compare it to Yom Kippur, not compare the Yom HaShmini to Shavuos, the Shnei Elam, because on Shmini Atzeres they brought 2 Elam, which was not the same carbon that they brought on Yom Kippur nor on the Yom HaShmini. So that would fit in great. This narrative fits in perfectly if you learn that on Yom Kippur, in fact, there was only one aisle. But there's a man a Tana who holds that they actually brought 2 separate Elam on Yom Kippur. So now Yom Kippur, the carbon of Yom Kippur is not either parallel to the carbon that was brought on the Yom HaShmini. So then I would ask, why is the Yom HaShmini compared to Yom Kippur? Why isn't it Shavuos? Now we're going to get into the machloikis of if there was one aisle or 2 Elam. Titania with Brisa. Rabbi Omer, Ayel Echad, Hu Amar Khan, Hu Amar B'Chomesh HaPekudim. The Ayel Echad, it was mentioned in Achrei Mos, in the Parsha. Achrei Mos is the Parsha that discusses what happened on Yom Kippur, and in Chomesh HaPekudim, which I believe is in the Midbar in Pinchas, right? When it discusses all of the Musafin, Rashi tells us it also mentions an aisle. So Rabbi says it's talking about the same aisle. So therefore, there's only one aisle. In fact, there's 2 separate Elam brought there. So the problem is, if there's 2 separate Elam brought on Yom Kippur, then the carbon of Yom Kippur is not similar to the carbon of the Yom HaShmini. So once again, why is it that Yom Kippur gets the isolation? Why doesn't Shavuos get the isolation? So tomorrow, Afilu Temer, Belezer B'Shimon, even if you hold that there are in fact 2 Elam on Yom Kippur, Hasam Chad L'Choy V'Sayayim, the Chad L'Musafin, Lafuki Atzeres T'Tavay Choy V'Sayayim. Even if there were 2 Elam on Yom Kippur, but one of them was for the Choy V'Sayayim, which is the karbonos of the day, and one of them was for the Musaf of Yom Kippur. So there's really only one that's for the Musaf of Yom Kippur, and there's only one for the Choy V'Sayayim. But on Shavuos, they were both Choy V'Sayayim, they were not part of the Musafin, and therefore, because on Shavuos, they were the Choy V'Sayayim, they were brought with the Shtei Alechem, and therefore, since both carbonos are Choy V'Sayayim versus on Yom Kippur, where there was only one carbon Choy V'Sayayim, and by the Shmini L'Malum was also only one carbon Choy V'Sayayim, and therefore we compare Yom Kippur to the Yom HaShmini rather than Shavuos. For the Gemara, the Ema Rosh Hashanah, maybe it should be Rosh Hashanah, because once again, the Prisha Shiva L'Yom Echadu, Rosh Hashanah, the Raisa was 1 day, and you isolate 7 days before Rosh Hashanah. Once again, how do you know that Yom Kippur? Amar Bavo, Donin Par V'Ayil Shaloi, Mi Par V'Ayil Shaloi. We are looking for a carbon that's the Kohen's carbon himself. Lafuke and Zeres. So this will also be a reason why it shouldn't apply to Shavuos and Rosh Hashanah as well. To Tzipora Rochel. Sure, there was a par and aisle that was brought, but on Rosh Hashanah and on Shavuos, it was a carbon Tzipora. We're looking for a carbon that's a personal carbon for the Kohen Gadol. That you have on Yom Kippur, that you had on the Yom HaShmini. So let's see.
From the earliest times, they held a 2-day Rosh Hashanah. because they didn't know which one it would be. They couldn't depend on the Adam coming because it's the first day of the year.
But
So
with the rice, it's still one day.
But they didn't hold one. They held 2 days, even in Eretz Yisrael.
Yeah, but the Gabi the Drasha, you can argue that it's parallel to the Yom HaShmini.
Yeah, Gabi the Drasha, yes, probably could.
Okay, so let's see Rashi over here. The Maluim Mishaloihu on the Shemani Shemei on the Yom HaShmini, it was a personal carbon. I'll take it to you for yourself. It's a personal carbon. Once again, it's the Kohen's personal carbon. He has a separate carbon that he brings for the Tzibor, but this is a carbon that's his personally. It says, "B'zoi shavi ayin al kodesh, l'pav and bekal chatas, l'fuka." It says for Shoshana that your kabbanis there are kabbanis Tzibor. Zok the Gemara, hanicha l'mandam kach loch mishaloch. That would work out well if you taka learn that on Yom Kippur the carbon that the Kohen brings is his own personal carbon. He pays for it with his own money, and it's his own personal carbon. Hanicha l'mandam kach loch is mishaloch. When the Torah says kach locha, it means you have to pay for it yourself. And vaselach, which is not related to our sugya, but the Torah says, Rashi tells us, aselacha shtecha tzotros kesef. When Moshe Rabbeinu was told to make himself trumpets, once again, the same mandam who learns that kachlecha by the carbon means you pay for it, it's your own. Same with the tzotros, Moshe was told to pay for it on his own. Ela mandam mishal tzibor. According to the mandam who learns that even when it says kachlecha and aselacha, it also means mishal tzibor. Ma'ikal meimer. Once again, what's the difference between Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, where you also have the same parallel carbon? The Tanya we learned, Kach lecha mishalacha, v'asei mishalacha. That's if it says Kach lecha or asei lecha. What if it says v'yikchu lecha? If it says v'yikchu lecha, that's mishal tzibur. So Kach lecha means you have to pay for it. V'yikchu lecha, which the pasuk says sometimes as well, that means mishal tzibur. Divi Rabbi Yoshia. Rabbi Yoshia ben Kach lecha. Either way, it means that the communal funds pay for it. Why does the Torah change the notion? Instead of saying why does the Torah say in those places kach lecha? And the next line is an extremely difficult line to read and to understand. It means Hashem is telling the Kohen Gadol, I don't even want a carbon from the people. It's your carbon that I want. I don't even like them, which is very difficult to express here. So let's see Rashi inside. I heard shot in this is Mhoya Tzibur Yochel Eskaper Bishel Yochid Mishalacha Yisi writes it. If I could have taken care of whatever the Tzibur's needs are by just taking your personal carbon, I would so much more prefer that, which is Hashem expressing a sentiment of not liking Klal Yisrael, which is very, very difficult. Which Rashi says, it's very difficult to suggest that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is repulsed by Klal Yisrael. So that's why Omer Kivayochel. That's why it says Kivayochel. Kloimer al Karchenu Yomer. We're saying it because we're stuck. So either Kivayachal means the HaKadosh Baruch Hu saying that, because we refer to Hashem as a Kivayachal, or it's Kivayachal meaning it's hard to express such a harsh thought. But Al Kalponim, we have a Mandamar who learned that Kach Lecha does not mean that you're paying for it by yourself. Abachanan Amar Mishum Rabbi Eliezer, Kasav Echad Omer. One pasuk says, "Vasisa lecha aroinates." One pasuk says, "Vasisa lecha." It's as if it was a private commandment to Moshe. You make yourself an aroinates. The Kasav Echad Omer. But another pasuk says, "Vasu aroinates seishitim," which is mashma all of Klal Yisrael. Haketa. What is the tzivur? Kan bisman she Yisrael oisen v'choyne shalmokim. When they're when they're doing the Ratzon, when Klal Yisrael is doing the Ratzon of Hashem, so Rashi, Nikris ha'avodah al Shemam. Then the avodah is referred to as the avodah of all of Klal Yisrael. And kan bisman shein oisin Ratzon Shamakim. When Klal Yisrael is not doing the Ratzon Hashem, Hashem looks at it like the chosen tzaddik who's doing the avodah, the Kohen Gadol, it's his avodah personally. And he doesn't look at the fact that maybe Klal Yisrael is not doing Ratzon Shamakim. He's looking at the tzaddik and he's accepting the avodah from him.
If you go back for a second just to the Yechon Mishalach and the Yosy Mishalach, is that also going on a specific Kohen Gadol? Is that a pasuk?
No, Kaviyachol is the lashon of the Gemara. The pasuk is kach lecha.
Right. So the Gemara is what is saying Mishalach and Yosy goes to Mishalach, right?
It's a brisa. It's a tana.
Brisa.
Yeah.
So now that brisa can't be referring to a specific Kohen. It's speaking about the Kohen Gadol, whoever he may be.
Well, the kach lecha at that time was speaking to Aaron HaKohen.
So the Gemara is saying that the kach lecha was referring to Aaron HaKohen. What I'm driving at is if we're speaking about a specific Kohen Gadol, then we know that the Kohen Gadol there at that time was a tzaddik, and it might have made sense to say that.
But I say the second Beis Hamikdash, there they were maybe even worse than the Tzipora.
Right.
No, Hashem was talking to Aaron HaKohen at the time.
Yosy, Art Scroll says Moshe Rabbeinu.
Was talking to Moshe Rabbeinu?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's what the Bryce means, that we would rather have the Moshe Rabbeinu than from.
He says it on the Aseh lecha or on the kach lecha?
Is Moshe Rabbeinu?
Yeah, because the kach lecha was speaking to the karbanos of Yom Kippur, and it was Aaron who paid for those karbanos, not Moshe. The Aseh lecha was Moshe making the chatzotros.
It says
On the kach lecha.
Yosy kach lecha is by Miluim, not by Yom Kippur.
Oh, okay. So then
And that's
no, but it's the kach lecha is both by Miluim and Yom Kippur, because that's the whole meaning over here. Is by Miluim we know it was your own, and we're trying to say that in Yom Kippur as well it was on your own. Lafuke Rosh Hashanah, which was Shel Tzibur.
yeah, but Rashi says the last Rashi on that Amud, the Miluim Mishaloi who do Ksiv kach lecha egel. That's Miluim. Yom Kippur is bezois of Aaron al Kodesh.
Aha. Okay. Very good. That's right. So I'm mistaken. So that's the kach lecha is speaking only about Moshe, about the Miluim, and that's how you know that Moshe had to pay for it. The way you know that the Kohen pays for it on Yom Kippur is because bezois Yahweh Aaron al Kodesh.
Right.
Okay. So explain.
So now that we established that it was Moshe Rabbeinu, why is it so difficult to say that Hashem would rather a carbon from Moshe Rabbeinu rather than from that generation?
It's hard to say that a Kadosh Baruch Hu is repulsed by Klal Yisrael
Even
in any time.
at any time.
Yeah.
Okay. He could destroy us and make a new nation from Moshe Rabbeinu, but he wouldn't be repulsed by it. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so let's see what the Gemara says over here. So based on that, where it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to take it by yourself, what are you going to do? Zok to Gemara, Akan loy pligi, the machlokes that we've just discussed. We had a machlokes over here whether or not it has to come from Moshe himself or not. Alabakicha is to Alma, Vasio is to Alma. This machlokes is referring to other places in the Torah where it mentions kicha. However, kichas to alma. What is an example of a kichas to alma? Is kach lecha samin when it's talking about the preparation of the Torahs. Asiyas to alma is like Rashi told us earlier. Asay lecha shtei chatzotros kesef when Moshe was told to make the trumpets. Aval hanach. But by the Maluim, Perusha Kamafarish, the Mishalachu. These two, by the Maluim and Yom Kippur, it's very explicit that these for sure had to be paid for by Moshe Rabbeinu himself. But Maluim, Michti, Ksivit says, Al B'nai Yisrael, Tidaber Lemar, Kechu Sir Izim Lachatos. It says, tell Klal Yisrael to bring a Sir Izim Lachatos. And then the Pasuk is a stickler repetitive. And the Pasuk of Vayomel Aaron, Kach Lecha, Egel ben Bakar Lachatos. Why did the Torah repeat that? If the Torah already said Chuch Sirizim Lachatos, the lashon of the pasuk before is kachu sirizim, and then there's a change in nusach of kach lecha. So from the change in nusach, so Rashi says the shani kra b'dibure mimash eshchol daber. The fact that in the first pasuk it says kach, it says chu, and in the second pasuk it says kach lecha, clearly the Torah is trying to indicate that there's a difference. Shema mino kach lecha mishalachu. So that's how you knew that by the Maluyim, it's for sure, no matter what everybody holds in the general kicha, like we had in the Brisa, by Maluyim, it was definitely a tzivui that indicated that it had to be paid for by Moshe Rabbeinu himself. The Yom Kippurim as well. Michti, Siv Bezois Yavoi Aaron ala Kodesh. With this, Aaron will come to the Kodesh, the Par ben Boker lachatos, and then it says, Ume'es Adas b'nei Yisrael Yikach Shnei Seirim lachatos, v'hikr v'sparachatos asher loy alamali. Why did the Torah once again stick in the asher loy? Shemamina hai loy mishaloy. So you see once again the Torah is indicating that on Yom Kippur the animal has to be brought personally. Okay, Zok to Gemara weiter. Shemamina hai loy mishaloy. Rabashi Omar, Rabashi had a different story. He said, Donin par lachatos va'ayel la'oila, mi par lachatos va'ayel la'oila. The comparison that we're making from Miluyim, and we are saying it's exclusively applying to Yom Kippur, is because just like by the Miluyim, there was a par for a chatos and an ayel for an oila, so too on Yom Kippur, there was a par for a chatos and an ayel for an oila. Va'fuki Rosh Hashanah va'atzeres, that even though there's a par and there's an ayel, but the tervayu oilers, they're both carbon oilers. So since it's not exactly the same carbon, we would say that the Yom Kippur is more parallel. The Yom HaShmini, that's what we learn from the Yom HaShmini. Ravina Omar, Ravina says, Danin avoida b'chayin gadol, may avoida b'chayin gadol. We want to learn a case where the Kohen Gadol is doing the avoida, like Yom Kippur, where only the Kohen Gadol does the avoida, from the Miluyim, where once again, only the Kohen Gadol did the avoida. Lafuche kula kishyasim. This teretz will answer all of the kashas about all the Yom Tovim and all the general chatoyis. They all don't have that feature. The lav avoida b'kain gadol nidu. All the other kashas that the Gemara asked, maybe this day, maybe that day, all those days the avoida doesn't have to be done with the kain gadol. Yom Kippur is unique, just like the Yom HaShmini is unique, that the avoida is done exclusively with kain gadol. As Rashi says, Yom Kippurim avoida b'kain gadol b'meluyim dechsiv v'yakriv Aaron al hamizbech. Zok to Gemara, the Ikad Amri Amar Ravina, or there's another nusach as to what Ravina's answer was, and that was done in avoida tchila may avoida tchila lafukehani delav tchilinini. We're going to learn an avoida that's a first from an avoida that's a first lafuke all the other yom tovim that are not a first. So what does tchila mean? My tchila. What do you mean it's a first? Ilema tchila b'kain gadol. If tchila means that it's done only with the kain gadol, hainu kamaisa. That was exactly what we just said. It was the first nusach of Ravina. So that can't mean what the second nusach of Ravina is. Ella, what it's saying is avoida tchila b'makayim me avoida tchila b'makayim. And this, I love this prat. I don't know why, but I like this prat very much. So let's see what it says. Tchila b'makayim Yom Kippurim. Yom Kippurim is the first time they're doing the avoida in this place. What does that mean? Yesh boy avoida l'fnai v'l'chnim. On Yom Kippurim, they do the avoida in a place where they never do the avoida there. On Yom Kippur, they do the avoida in the Kodesh HaKodeshim, which is unprecedented anywhere. Should be Yom Kippurim Harishon, and the very first Yom Kippur, on the first Yom Kippur, the first Yom Kippur was the very first time that avoida was ever done in the Kodesh HaKodeshim. Shekodim lachem, because before Yom Kippur, nobody set foot into the Kodesh HaKodeshim. When they inaugurated the Mishnah, no one set foot into the Kodesh HaKodeshim. The very first time that anyone set foot into the Kodesh HaKodeshim, besides its construction, of course, for avoida, was on Yom Kippur. And that's similar to Yom HaShmini L'Meluyim, Hos Avoida Tchila, the Mizbech HaChitzon. The Yom HaShmini L'Meluyim was the very first time they did avoida on the Mizbech HaChitzon. I'm not sure why Rashi picks the Mizbech HaChitzon. Any avoida done anywhere in the Beis Hamikdash was the first time of the Yom HaShmini. The Mishvil Sheshimis Moshe called Shivas Yemei Maluyim You might ask that Yom HaShmini was in fact not the first day of Avodah, because all 7 days of Miluyim, Moshe Rabbeinu was doing Avodah. That's Dr. Gemara. Dr. Rashi ain't Kriya Avodah, Eitzel Avodah Kahanim. Compared to the real Avodah done by the Kahanim, Moshe's Avodah was not the real thing. Why? Shu Bilvush, Big Day Kahuna. The Kahanim, when they did the Avodah, they did it in the right uniform. The Shal Moshe, the Chaluk Lavan, he just wore a white beged. So it was only a temporary measure. It was a training period. So Zok Ravina, in the second nusach, we want to compare Yom Kippur to the Yom HaShmini, because just like Yom Kippur, it was the first Yom Kippur was the very first time Avodah was done in this place, in the Mokum of the Kodesh HaKodeshim. So too on the Yom HaShmini, it was the very first time Avodah was done on the Mizbeach. Zok the Gemara weiter. Ki also Rav Dimi Amar Rabbi Yochanan. When Rav Dimi came, he said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that Rabbi Yochanan masni chada and Rabbi Shua ben Levi masni tarti. Now we have a pasuk, the pasuk that started this all off, where we know from there that there was isolation anywhere else besides the Yom HaShmini. It says kasher asa b'yom hazeh tziva shem lasos l'chaper alechem. So we learn two things from this pasuk. The lasos is referring to the Parah Adumah. The chaper alechem, after this long struggle, we finally came to the conclusion that it's referring exclusively to Yom Kippur. So Zok Gemara, Rabbi Yochanan didn't agree to that. Rabbi Yochanan said masni chada. He only learned one. He only learned one out of this pasuk. So Rashi tells us which one did he skip. Rabbi Yochanan masni chada lo dorish mehaykra the kasher asa b'yom hazeh l'chada prisha. He only learned one prisha. So the Gemara will tell us which one. Rabbi Shua ben Levi masni tarki. Rabbi Shua ben Levi learned like what we said, that it's referring to both Parah Adumah as well as Yom Kippur. Rabbi Yochanan masni chada, which was lasos. L'chaper elu masa Yom Kippurim. So Rabbi Yochanan is telling us that this pasuk is only alluding to Yom Kippur, but Parah Adumah, that you need isolation before the Parah Adumah, you don't see that from this pasuk at all. How are we going to know it? We'll soon see. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi masni tarti. Lasos is elu ma'aseh para, like we learned earlier, and the chaper is elu ma'aseh Yom Kippurim. So, frek the Gemara, Rabbi Yochanan masni chada. Rabbi Yochanan says that from this pasuk you only know one thing, and that is Yom Kippur. But v'hanan tnan, we do know that halacha is shivas yomim koidim Yom Kippurim and v'shivas yomim koidim shreifas hapara, that you also have to isolate 7 days. So why do you isolate 7 days before the shreifas hapara if there's no pasuk to teach us that? It's just an extra chumrah. Why would we have an extra chumrah just for the fun of it? Zok Rashi, like we learned yesterday, since we learned yesterday, who say that a tfil yoim cannot be oisik in the Parah Adumah, we bedafka make the coin into a tfil yoim, which shows a little bit of a callous towards the Parah Adumah. And in order that people shouldn't view Parah Adumah lightly, we packed on many chumras, also by malas rabbis. So this is another chumrah that was added on, that they had to isolate for 7 days. Amar Rabbi bar Chalakia, Amar Rabbi Machashi bar Idi, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. It says as follows: Kasher asa b'yoyim hazeh, tziva Hashem lasos l'chaper alechem. Our pasuk by the Shemoni Shemei Melur, and he darshans as follows: Lasos elu ma'aseh para, l'chaper elu ma'aseh Yom Kippurim. So you see that Rabbi Yochanan is masni tarti, because he's learning both of the drushes. Sai l'chaper alechem for Yom Kippur, and sai lasos for the ma'aseh para. So the Gemara Ahuda Rabbi, the brisa that the member that we just quoted, where Rabbi Yochanan does learn both things from the pasuk, is not really Rabbi Yochanan's own Torah. He was saying his Torah over from his Rebbe. The Chiyasa Ravin, Rabbi Yochanan, Mishum Rabbi Shmuel. So here Rabbi Yochanan is saying it over in the name of his Rebbe, who was Rabbi Shmuel. Lasos elu ma'aseh para, l'chaper elu ma'aseh Yom Kippurim. So Rabbi Yochanan himself held that you only learn Yom Kippur from the pasuk, but his Rebbe, Rabbi Shmuel, who he's saying over in his name, holds that we learn both items out of the pasuk, Sai Parah Adumah and Sai Yom Kippur. Amalei Rish Lakish. We are B'yochanan. Mehecha kayalfasla. Where are you learning out that on Yom Kippur, this pre-shot, where you're learning it from? You're learning it from Elohim. Well, if you're learning it from Elohim, we have a complication because you can't pick and choose. If you're learning it from Elohim, then you have to compare Yom Kippur completely to Elohim. And the Imam Elohim, Kol HaKosov B'hem, Ma'akev B'hem, by Elohim, everything that's written in the Parshas of Elohim had to be done, and if it wasn't, it will be possible. And Rashi tells us on the Afei Amar Aleph, we're going to see the psukim that indicate that if it wasn't done precisely as per the instructions, it was possible. So Afacha, so too on Yom Kippur, it has to be done precisely as per the instructions. Hachanami kol HaKosov B'hem, Ma'akev B'hem. V'chi Tema. And if you want to argue, Hachanami, yeah, and Hachanami. Of course, everything, all the rules of Yom Kippur are Ma'akev, and if you don't do it exactly the way it's supposed to be done, it's going to be possible. For the Gemara, that's not the case. Because Vaknan, we learned in our very Mishnah, Umaskinin loy koyin acher. We prepare another coin for him. If you hold that it has to be done perfectly, this second coin, you didn't isolate him. So if you didn't isolate him, and something happens, a psul happens with the original coin you did isolate, and now the second coin has to step in, well, he didn't isolate. So how could he be kosher? If you hold that all of the halachas are ma'akiv, then the halacha of prisha, which we're learning from Elohim, are also ma'akiv. So then the substitute coin that you've set up here didn't have prisha. V'chitema, my maskinin, mafrishin, and if you're going to argue, no, when the Mishnah said that maskinin, you set up another coin, it meant you have a backup coin also go through the prisha, and he will be comply, even if there's a psul in the first coin, and we need a second coin, he would have also been prepared. Dr. Gemara, it doesn't make sense to say that that's what the Mishnah means. Because listening, oy idi vidi miskinin, oy idi vidi mafrishin. Either both at the beginning of the Mishnah, when it discussed Hafrasha, used the word mafrishin, well, it should have used that same term to explain how you prepare the second coin. So if we look inside the Mishnah, it says, Shivas Yamam Kadi Mamikor Mafrishin Kohen Gadol Mibeisai. And then it should have said, Umafrishin Loi Kohen Achetachto. And you also prepare a second Kohen Gadol in the same fashion. But it says Maskinin Loi. So the fact that there's a difference in Loshen between Mafrishin of the original Kohen Gadol and Maskinin to the replacement Kohen Gadol, it clearly shows that the second Kohen Gadol does not have to be punished. So that means the way we're setting this up, it's quite possible that we're not going to be sticking to all of the rules. And one of the things up Shlokish that we need to learn from Elohim is that you have to stick to the rules. Omer Lei, so Rosh Shlokish, Rav Yechon has a problem. Rosh Shlokish has good kasha. So Rav Yechon does Rosh Shlokish, so obviously you're not going to learn Yom Kippur from Elohim, because then we have a problem. So Elamar Mehechi Aleph. So where do you know? How do you understand our Mishnah? How are you going to know that before Yom Kippur you have to be mafresh for 7 days? Amar, he said, Misinai, I know it from Kabbalah Satira. The Chesiv, it says by Kabbalah Satira, a Yishkain Kvoit Hashem al Har Sinai. The Ruach of Hashem rested on Har Sinai. Vayichaseyu ha'anan sheishes yom. And it was covered over with a cloud for 6 days. Vayikra al Moshe b'yoyim hashvi. And Hashem called out to Moshe b'yoyim hashvi. So Michti, let's understand the psukim. Siv vayikra al Moshe b'yoyim hashvi. It says that he called to Moshe Rabbeinu b'yoyim hashvi. My sheishes yom. Why did it say sheishes yom? In other words, it says the Yishkoy put Hashem al Har Sinai, v'chaseyu anan, vayikra Moshe b'yoyim hashvi. Why did it have to stick in that there's the 6 days before with the Kisa Anan? Dr. Gemara, I'll tell you what. Zeh Bona'af. From here we learn a rule, the Chalatar Kula, Shechala Nichnas B'machna Shchina. Anytime you're approaching the Shchina, Ta'an Prisha Shisha, automatically you have to separate for 6 days. And the Rosh Lakish, this is the Makor. Before the Kohen Gadol goes in to the Kodesh HaKodeshim, he has to have a prisha of 6 days, just like you see by Kabbalah Torah. The Torah says 6 days to teach us that there's this din of prisha. In fact, that's a really nice shot. But for non Shivatam, the problem is it's not 6 days, it's 7 days that we're looking for. The Gemara, Masnisin Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseirahi. Our Mishnah will go according to Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, who Rashi tells us as on the Fof of Aleph, the chayish letumas beisai. He has once you have a tumah, even though you only need a hafresh of 6 days, but there's another complication. So let's see Rashi. Shema, im yizokak leishta. If he's going to have relations with his wife, the sira dam b'shasbia, and she'll be parish nida b'shasbia, which will now make him tamei for 7 days. V'nim zetamei shivis yamin kemishpat boyel nida. He will become tamei just like a nida for 7 days, and then v'lo yachal lavid b'yam kipurim. So the reason why we have to separate him that extra 7th day is to make sure that he'll be Torah. So you see from Rish Lakish that the Prisha has 2 reasons for it. There's a Prisha to make sure he's not Tomei, but there's also a Prisha that's always required, even if it's not a question of Tumah, there's a Prisha that's always required in preparation of going Lefnai v'Lefnim, of approaching Kedusha. According to me, that I learned that the whole makar of the 7 days is from the Shemani Shemei Meluyim. Hainu the Tanya, that would make sense why we learned this halacha in a brayse. That zev zeh side the kohen of Yom Kippurim and side the kohen of Parah Aduma, mazin alov kol shiva. They spritz on him may Parah Aduma mikol chatoish shahoyu sham, and Rashi tells us mikol Parah upara. But I guess all of the previous Parah Adumas they spritz on all these kohanim. They saved. They never completely used up the paraduma ashes. Rather, they always saved some. So when they were preparing the kohen gadol for Yom Kippur, and when they were preparing the kohen to process another paraduma, they took a little bit of all the previous ashes from the previous paraduma and they spritzed on them every day. But Nishamati that Efer Parashamoshalakala, the original paraduma, never ever got used up. So Zok Gemara. You could say that there was hazah by Meluyim as well. So Rashi, the Prisha de Meluyim calls Ayin. You could say that there was that spritzing as well. Yaz Aaron, Shivish Yamim Mimale Shadam, calls Ayin also lahem kechayk b'yom rishon. You can say that by Meluyim they also spritzed every day. El Didach the office Messinai, but you who are learning that the Prisha comes because by Sinai you see there was a Prisha hazah b'Sinai mihavoi. There was no hazah by Sinai. There was no spritzing. It was just a separation. So how would you know? How do we know the halacha that they have to spritz the mei paraduma on the kohen gadol before he goes into the Beis Kodesh HaKodeshim? If you don't see it from Har Sinai, that's something you would only know from Yom HaShmini. I guess we better stop here. It's so much work to learn Yuma with Rashi. It's such like a vacation, such a break.